So this is the second video lecture on the chapter on race. The previous one, I just defined it. I defined the idea of race. Sometimes you may hear this notion that race is both a myth and a reality. And what that means is, so again, I suggested it's an idea, or sociologically we talk about race as an idea, but it's both a myth and a reality. And what we mean by that is people really do look different, right? So my complexion is really different than a person of, so obviously, like there's a difference between the way people look. But the myth is that these superficial differences in the way people look are somehow fundamental to their humanness, or that it's somehow fundamental to other aspects of who they are. A better way really to think about it is, I think the example I heard one time was the idea of a domestic cat, right? That cats they can be orange, or they can be white, or they can be black, but they're all domestic cats. So the notion that there's somehow some sort of subspecies, that would only be true if black and white people and brown people and everywhere in between could not intermate. And clearly humans can intermate with each other. And the only thing that's really different is the superficial things, our color, our hair texture, these kinds of things, right? So this is what we mean by it is real, because people really do look different. It's a myth because how many races are there? This is a really important question. How many races are there? I'm going to give you just a second to think about that. The answer is there's one. There is one race, and that is the human race. And amongst the human race, people look different. They have superficial differences, their hair texture, their skin color, but there is only one race. But the idea that people who look different are fundamentally different, we could actually create, quote unquote, we could create a race of people who look different. And the way we would do that is I think the example goes is you put a bunch of redheaded people on an island for a really, really long time, and eventually everyone would begin to look like each other, right? And that is fundamentally, if you want to think anthropologically, or even evolutionarily, the reason that people look different is because their deep ancestry, like over millennia, where their ancestors, what part of the world, what part of the globe people came from, their melanin and the texture of their hair evolved to serve some function. So one of the examples is long hair holds more heat in, and fair complexion soaks up more vitamin D. So think about parts of the world that would need more heat, and to soak up more vitamin D would be places in northern climates. So fair complected, straight haired people, their deep ancestry over millennia were from northern or from the poles or northern hemispheres. But darker complexion, curly hair allows heat to escape. Darker complexion protects someone from the UV rays. People with these characteristics, their deep ancestry is from the globe, is from the equator, is from hotter climates. And if you think historically, folks would not necessarily have seen one another. Fast forward though, and we have global travel, and that's not necessarily the same thing. And in fact, humans are increasingly starting to look more like each other. Their complexions are becoming darker. Dark eyes are considered a dominant trait, and this has to do with a lot more intermarriage and which physical characteristics are genetically dominant. Blue eyes, blonde hair is genetically recessive. So if you remember from your human growth and development or your genetics class or your biology class, that means if those qualities, right? All right, I'm going to sort of, same thing with like black cats and black dogs, right? There are more black cats and black dogs because those are dominant genetic traits. Okay. All right, I could talk more about that, but I need to move on. Ethnicity. So ethnicity is a little bit more like the gender. When I was talking about the parallels between race and ethnicity and sex and gender, ethnicity is cultural. So and we commonly in our culture get these things confused. When we call someone African American, right, we're really, well, that's not the best example. The better example, oh, and I should have looked at this before I started recording this. The better example is the term for Latino and Hispanic and Mexican, because those are really ethnic, right? Those have more to do with the cultural practices, the language, and the region of the world. But yet, if you were to look at if you were to look at like, oh, some sort of registration forms, you also often see those under the racial categories. Those are not racial categories, those are ethnic categories. So, ethnicity, remember going back to the chapter on culture where we had the term ethnocentric, right? Ethno meaning culture. Ethnicity is one's culture. And it is the way people, I think maybe I just said this, language, religion, traditions, belief. These are your ethnicities. A friend of mine in graduate school used to talk about how Americans don't have, white Americans like myself, that we don't really have ethnicity, right? His question, and of course others say that that's not correct, but his point is that as a white American, right? Unless you are indigenous, so unless you are a Native American or First People, all those mean the same. Native American, indigenous, and First People. Those refer to the people that were here before Europeans came here, right? Um, Unless you are one of these groups, you are an immigrant. You are either an immigrant or a slave, right? You were either brought here against your will or you came here for some reason. But back to my point about ethnicity, what my colleague was suggesting is that as white people, descendants of immigrants, so my people came as far back as the Mayflower, we don't necessarily have an ethnic identity. My mother's people came from England, my father's people came from Germany, but I don't acknowledge any of those ethnic backgrounds. So some would argue that my ethnicity is actually American. Okay, I better move on. So anyway, your ethnicity, unique cultural traits, a sense of community, feelings that your group is superior, and that your ethnic heritage, where you were born, is decided at your birth. And often we think about ethnicity as being sort of like territorial. Like they think of that being the home country, so to speak. We tend to be more ethnically sensitive, or our ethnicity becomes more salient, or more conscious of it when our group is small, or when our way of being, our dress, our language is really different from everybody else's. So, say in Manhattan, we have a group of people from Afghanistan, or Afghans, and their sense of their ethnic distinction or their ethnic identity is probably pretty strong because there's only maybe 50 people living in the whole town. The way the women dress and their language, where my ethnic identity, I rarely ever think about it because everywhere I go, people are speaking English. I know the culture. I don't dress any different than them. So our ethnic identity depends in part on how salient, um, how aware I am that my is different. And so in that sense, my colleague who said Americans don't have any ethnicity, he might have been right because I don't ever really think about it. Maybe I would if I lived, well, of course I would, if I went to another part of the world. Sometimes ancestry gets confused with ethnicity. So I found this nifty little idea, it may have been another textbook, and I wanted to highlight some of the differences here. Ancestry is, and this is where it gets, want to make sure that I'm clear. Ancestry refers to where people who share your genetic similarities come from. So ethnicity is your culture. You can be, your culture can be English, but you could potentially have be a descendant, say, of somebody from, I'm trying to think of another part of the world, of somebody from Russia, right? So what what people who do what we call deep ancestry, what deep ancestry or what's that, ancestry.com, what they do is identify what parts of the world people who have similar genetic codes as yourself come from. And that's sort of what this is intended to illustrate, right? This blue up here, these are people whose genetics, whose genes are very, very common in Germany. So they all may share some of the same genes because they are all descendants, right? Genetic descendants of people from Germany. People along here would share California, Texas, Arizona, would share genetic similarities with people who are in Africa. I'm sorry, Mexico. The lighter color here, and this kind of makes sense, right? Because when we stole Africans from Africa, when we brought them to the 13 colonies, that people over here, their genetics, their genes have more in common with people from Africa. I don't know what this means, American. I'm not sure what that means right there. So let's not confuse what we mean by ancestry refers to where our genes come from, or people who have similar genetic makeup as ourselves. Ethnicity is one's culture. Okay, I'm going to stop right here. When I come back, I want to talk about some more terms about intergroup relations.